We're here live at the Detroit Science Center at the Chrysler IMAX Dome Theater. Not that you really care about that, because today we're going to talk about the intro to political systems. So how political systems came to be. Our goals for today: to explain the purpose of government, to describe the four theories on the formation of governments, to describe the various ways in which we use to classify states, or another name for a state as a government, and compare and contrast the various levels of participation in the government. So if we take a look at this, this survey showed that most Americans really don't know much about the government. Only 52% of Americans could identify their senators, 53% their members in the House of Representatives, unable to identify. So, these numbers are huge. People don't know a lot about the government, and the government really makes the decisions for them. So if we're going to think about this, first we need to think about, why do we need a government in the first place? You may be wondering, well, who cares about government? It's just a bunch of old people. And the answer is that the government is there for you. The sole purpose of the government is to meet the needs of the people. And so we talked about people have needs. They have basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, water, and most important after all those basic needs, safety and security. And a lot of the safety and security is provided by the government. So again, if we talk about the needs of people: number one, protection. They need to be safe. Number two, public order, not have chaos within their lives. Number three, resolve conflict. So if we do have some type of disagreement, it's up to the government to solve that disagreement. Number four, to stabilize the economy. That doesn't mean control the economy, but it does mean that if the economy is out of control, the government needs to do something to help fix it. Number five, to provide public services. So things like roads or public transportation, sewer and water service, police and fire department, those are all provided by the government. And so if we want to think about, how does the government meet these needs? Well, the three branches of government, they make the laws: the legislative branch of government. Then we need somebody to enforce the laws. That's usually known as the executive branch. And then we need somebody to interpret the laws. That's usually known as the judicial branch. So if we talk about the three branches of government, the legislative makes the laws, the executive enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws or settles conflicts if we have any disagreements. So taking a look at this, you're probably wondering, well, what am I doing in this class? What is this class here for? This class, we are here to study politics. We talked about most people not knowing about their political system. Well, politics is the study of the political systems. It is the debate about what the government decides the rules are, or basically the who gets what, where, when, why, and how. So if we want to talk about, how do we get things, how do we decide what roads get fixed, how do we decide where police departments get built or fire departments get built, those are all decided by politics. Politics answers that question for us. And if we want to go to even more of a basic group, there are basically four ways to answer these questions. Four theories on how governments came to be in order to tell us the who gets what, where, when, why, and how. And so if we go through them, we can look at the origins of government. The first origin of government, the first way that government supposedly came to be, was through force. One person decided that they were bigger, better, stronger than everybody else, and so they used their power to take control of governments. Now, some governments, like most monarchies, not all monarchies, but most monarchies, king and queen decide, I'm more powerful than you, therefore I get to be in charge. In Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler decided, I'm more powerful than you, so I get to be in charge. The second theory on the origins of government is the evolution theory. Evolution, I'm in charge because, well, my father knows best. This is not commonly used in governments today, but this suggests that governments formed out of the family. The governments look very similar to what a family might look like. And so you have the eldest person who is in charge, the next eldest under that, the next eldest under that. And so just like families, maybe mom or dad is in charge, and then the kids, and then the grandkids, and then the great-grandkids. That's the same thing that happens with some early forms of government. Basically, most Native American tribes back in the day used to work this way. Council of elders in some societies used to function this way. Not very effective if you've got a very large group of people you're trying to rule. So most governments today don't use the evolution theory, but some do, and so it's worth pointing out. The next origin of government, divine right. Basically, this says that all power comes from God. So if a God tells us that we're in charge, we claim that God gives us the power to rule. And so most monarchies, most kings and queens also not only rule because they're most powerful, but many of them claim that they have the right to rule because God or some type of God or creator gave them the right to do so. Moses led the people because he said that God was calling him. Today, the Pope is called by God to lead, and the pharaohs in ancient Egypt would be another example of that. So people who claim that they have the right or the power to rule because God told them to, that is what is known as divine right. And then finally, social contract. Social contract is the system we have in America today, and it basically says, I'm in charge because you want me to be in charge, because you want me to meet your needs. It's an agreement by the people. It's a contract, an agreement by people. That's where the social part comes in. And so if we look at social contract, first we have to look at what was life like before any government. And life before any government is sometimes what we would call the state of nature, and sometimes what Thomas Hobbes, the famous philosopher, described life in the state of nature as being nasty, brutish, and short. See, if we have absolute freedom, if we have total freedom to do whatever we want, chances are I'm going to try to take advantage of that. And you are, and you are, and you are. And we're all going to try to take advantage of that. If we had freedom to do whatever we wanted, then we'd have to worry about killing each other or hurting each other. And so absolute freedom to do whatever we want, we've decided in the world today that maybe that's not the best way of doing things. And so instead, what we do is we have a social contract. We agree to give up some of our freedom, and in return, hopefully that will create some security. Hopefully that social contract that's created will create security within our world. So if I agree not to punch you in the face, you agree not to punch me in the face, yes, we've given up some of that total freedom, but at the end of the day, we're both better off because we don't have to worry about punching each other in the face. And so if we give up some power in order to create more safety and security within society, this is known as the social contract theory. Now that we've decided where our source of power comes from, we've got to look at what's our government going to look like. And so there are a number of different ways we could structure our government. We could have a unitary government, a confederate government, or a federal government. And so if we go back to this question, we ask, why do people live in groups? People live in groups to meet their needs. People have needs, and these needs that we talked about before, the groups help us meet those needs. They help us create a society where there is structure, where there is order. And what we essentially form in the world today is what is known as a state. Now, we often think about states as being the state of Michigan or the state of California. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about a state. A state, in political science terms, is actually another name for a country. So anytime you hear the word state in this class, sometimes you need to think country. And so why do we live in groups? Why do we form countries? Well, to meet the needs of the people, to meet our needs. And so there are a couple characteristics of a state. There are several things we need to have, 4 things we need to have in order to have a state. First of all, we need people. We've got to have a population, and those people have to identify with something, some sense of national loyalty. So in order to have a country, first of all, we need people. But there are a lot of people in the world out there who don't necessarily have a country. So the second thing we need is land. We need territory. We need borders that are recognized by other countries in the world. The third thing that we need is sovereignty. We need actual control over that land. So if I claim that I have land, but I don't actually have control to do whatever I want on the land, then technically speaking, I'm not sovereign. I'm not truly free. So the third thing we need to have a country is absolute sovereignty, control over our policy. And then the fourth thing we need is a government. We need some type of institution to make and enforce public policy. We need somebody who decides what the rules are going to be, and we need somebody to enforce those rules for us. There are many entities in the world that have 2 or 3 of these, but not all 4. In order to have a state, in order to have what we would call a country, you need population, territory, absolute sovereignty, and a government. So if we want to look at what those governments look like, there are different ways we can look at how to classify a state, classify a government, and basically it all depends on where the power comes from. There's what's known as a unitary government, where power comes from the central government, a confederate government, where power comes from the state or local governments, and the federal government, where there is shared power. So let's go take a look at these in a little bit more detail. In a unitary government, the type of government that they have in Great Britain, all of the power comes from the national government and is given to state or local or smaller entities, smaller parts of government. So in a unitary government, we have a very strong national government. We've got a very strong central government. And every smaller level of government just gets their power from the national government. So for example, in Great Britain, the government is run in London, and local governments, state level governments, get their power from the national government. The complete opposite of this system is what is known as a confederate government, not just the Confederate States of the United States. Of course, that is probably the most famous example. But in a confederate government, power comes from the states and is given to the national government. So in the Confederate States of America, or even in Canada in sort of their original days, Canada is kind of tricky today, but in the original days, power came from the states, from the provinces, and was given to the national government. So in a Confederate government, states give power to the national government, and that's pretty much all the national government has the power to do. National government can't do whatever they want. National government can only do what the states give them the power to do. And so we have a very weak or a limited central government. Again, the examples we had, the Confederate States of America, basically the only reason why the states in the South got together is to form a military. That's about it. Canada technically sort of is a confederation, but it could also be a federal government, so don't get too wrapped up in that. But in those types of government, power comes from the states or the provinces, and it's given to the national government. The national government can only do what the smaller levels of government give them the power to do. And here in the United States, we have what is known as a federal government. Federal government is a situation where we have shared power between a national government, a central government, and several state or local or regional governments. So there are some things that only the national government can do in America, one of them being to form a military, form an army, or to print money. There are some things that only states are allowed to do, like issue licenses. And there are some things that both national and state level governments can do. A federal government is a system of shared power. And so, of course, the most famous example is the United States of America. There are some things that only the states can do. There are some things that only the national government can do. And there are some things that they both can do. Other examples would be Germany. There are maybe even France, if you want to look at them. There are a number of other governments out there where we have shared power. That brings us to level of participation in government. Who gets to be part of a government? Who gets to do what within a government? And there are three different ways of looking at things. There is a laissez-faire government, which means basically there is no government, completely hands-off. Democratic government, which puts power in the hands of many people, and an autocratic government, which puts power in the hands of a few people. Now, one way we can take a look at this, I kind of like to look at it as a scope of how we can draw things. There are several types of democratic governments. There is a direct democracy and an indirect democracy. And even within that, there are several types of indirect democracies. There's a presidential system, and then there is what is known as a parliamentary system. So if you get a little confused, try to come back to this chart, and hopefully that will make a little more sense to you. So first, if we look at how this type of government goes into play, we either have an authoritarian government where one person has power. Sometimes we have a few people in power. Sometimes we have many people in power. And sometimes we have nobody in power. So probably the most basic level of government is what is known as a laissez-faire government. It's a hands-off government. Laissez-faire is literally a French word that means hands-off, or or very little government action or government control. Sometimes what we would know as anarchy, and in a laissez-faire government, really nobody is in charge. The second type of government is an authoritarian government or an autocratic government. This is a situation where one or a few people have total or absolute control over the government. And so there are many different names for this. You may be familiar with some of them. An authoritarian form of government, a command form of government, a totalitarian form of government, total control. All these are autocratic forms of government. They're government where one person or a small group of people has total control and authority over the government. Next, we can also look at an authoritarian government as a dictatorship. So, for example, we see Fidel Castro or Saddam Hussein, dictators who had complete and absolute power over the government. An oligarchy is another form of totalitarian government. This is where a small group of people has power, and not very common in the world today, but it does exist in a few places. And then finally, we have what is known as a junta. It's not a junta, it's a junta, which is another name for a military oligarchy. And within a military oligarchy, basically, you've got the military rules the government instead of a small group of people. Next, we have a democracy. In democracy, power rests with the people. The citizens have power. Everybody has power within a democracy. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has unlimited power, but everybody gets to control the government in a democracy. It was once said that no government demands so much from the citizens as a democracy, and none gives so much back. So in a democracy, you actually have to do something. You can't just sit back. The government is not going to run itself. People are the source of power within the government. That means the people have to do something. This comes back to the idea of the social contract we talked about. People rule with the consent of the governed. People who are in charge because somebody wanted them to be in charge. Now again, there are a couple different types of democracies. There is a direct democracy, where people vote directly on every single policy and every single issue. Now, I'm sure you could think of some maybe not so great things about a direct democracy. If you wrote down that a direct democracy is very costly and very time consuming, you're right. If every single person in America, 300 million of them, had to vote on every single issue, every single bill, every single thing that was done in our country, we'd probably never actually get anything done. So, while direct democracy gives the most control to the people, it is also the most inefficient form of government. Next, we have what is known as a representative democracy, or sometimes what is called an indirect democracy. This is what we have in America. In fact, this is the type of democracy that most countries in the world have. And in a representative democracy, people vote for representatives, and those representatives make the policy. So maybe every 2 years in the case of the House of Representatives, every 4 years for the president, every 6 years for the Senate. People vote for the president or the House or the Senate, and those people will then make the laws for the next 2, 4, 6 years. So within a representative democracy, we have two different types that we could have. There's presidential or parliamentary. So the first system we're going to look at is a presidential system. In a presidential system, we have Congress is going to make the laws. Congress is elected by the voters. And then we also have a president, the executive branch, who is going to enforce the laws. And that president is also elected by the voters. So in a presidential system, the voters vote directly for the legislature, for the Congress, the people making the laws, and directly for the executive branch, the president, the person who's going to enforce the laws. And I like this chart because it shows voters vote for the executive branch, voters vote for the legislative branch. It gives a whole lot more control and power to the voters. Now, the problem with this system is it's highly inefficient. Sometimes you could get a president who is a Democrat and a Congress which is controlled by Republicans, or you could get vice versa. And if the president and Congress are from different political parties, things don't always get done. The legislative branch could always shoot down what the executive branch wants to do and vice versa. And so an executive branch, while it gives the most control to the people, it also sort of limits the power of the government. It has what are known as checks and balances. Each branch can do one thing that the other can't do, which is good, but by having separation of powers and checks and balances, it also puts limits on what can be done. It creates a somewhat inefficient system. So here's another chart looking at the same thing. The voters vote for the legislative branch. The voters vote for the executive branch. The other form of indirect democracy, or representative democracy, is what is known as a parliamentary system. And as you can see, Canada has a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, the people vote for the legislative branch. The people vote for the parliament, as it's called in this system. But then the parliament not only gets to make the laws, but they also get to select the chief executive. They also get to select what is known as the prime minister. So we've got a system where instead of separation of powers, we've got joint powers. So the person who makes the laws is the parliament, and they get to pick the executive, the prime minister, the people who are going to enforce the laws. So you can see that happening in this graph. The voters will vote for the parliament. The parliament will then select the prime minister. The advantage of this is it's really easy to get laws passed. It's really easy to get things done because the parliament is going to select somebody. The prime minister is going to be somebody who's from the same political party. So we don't necessarily have those same levels of checks and balances that we have in a presidential system. Without the separation of powers, it's easier to get stuff done. Of course, the downside is you don't have the checks and balances there. And so you have to decide what type of system do you want? Do you want a system that's more efficient, or do you want a system that maybe has a few more checks and balances? If we look at the chart, it'll show us the same thing. Voters vote for the legislative branch, and the legislative branch gets to choose the chief executive, the prime minister. If you want to look at the world, these are different levels of presidential systems, parliamentary systems, absolute monarchies, military dictatorships, etc. So you can check that out, and an updated one will be posted to Wikipedia. Normally we don't look at Wikipedia as a source, but in this case, probably gives us a pretty good idea of what states are under what type of government. You won't need to know that for the test, but in case you're curious who has what type of government. And I hope you have a wonderful day.